Oh, I didn't realize we were live already. Are we on for sure?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to This Is Not a Drill, Black Lives Matter. We are excited to have y'all as part of this conversation. Today, we'll be talking about protecting our children in foster care in the time of the coronavirus. We have a very dynamic panel to share with you all, and we want this to be interactive and lively discussion as we talk about an issue that is really important. As we get started, I want to introduce myself because I haven't had a chance to meet all of you. My name is LaMikia Castillo, and I am an organizer with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. I'm also on our policy team and do a lot of work related to that. And I'm your host today, so welcome. I also want to just get started by acknowledging that there's been a whole lot going on in the world around us. We've had, unfortunately, another Black person, a Black man, killed here in the United States. Just this past Monday, you all have been watching what's going on in the news after George Floyd was killed by police in Minnesota. And I just want to acknowledge that is really hard for so many of us, and we're angry. And this is a time for us to really get organized and make sure that we don't allow these things to continue to happen to our people. So I'm going to say his name. I'm going to say his name. I want everybody to say George Floyd, and we will continue. So say his name.
George Floyd.
Say his name. George Floyd. Thank y'all. So as I mentioned, today we are talking about child welfare, foster care, and families, and how the child welfare system impacts the Black community always, but especially right now during COVID. The reason why, one of the main reasons that we're talking about this this month is because it is Foster Care Awareness Month, right? The month of May is Foster Care Awareness Month. And as we kick off our conversation today, why does BLM care about foster youth? I want to make sure that we highlight some of the issues that foster care has, or some of the ways that foster care is impacting the Black community specifically. So for those of you who are not familiar with the foster care system, across the United States of America, there are over 440,000 children in foster care on any given day. So not just 440,000 for the whole year, on any given day in a year, right? So today there are 440,000 children in foster care. 55,000 of those live in California, and 30,000 are in Los Angeles, right? So think about that. 30,000 children in the foster care system. That means that these are children who have been taken away from their families and removed from their homes and from their communities. And most of them are put with strangers. Some of them are put in group homes. And in fact, some of them are also placed in detention centers, believe it or not, even though they shouldn't be placed in detention centers, they are. And so those are the numbers high level for the country and the state and the county. But I want to talk specifically about Black families and how the child welfare system impacts Black families here in Los Angeles. There are over the population of children in the county of Los Angeles is about 7%, right? But in terms of children in foster care, over 24, almost 25% of the children in foster care are Black. What does that mean? That means that there are 3 times as many of our population, right? So we are overrepresented in foster care by 3 times as much as our population of children in Los Angeles County. And this is such a big crisis and an issue that the Department of Children and Family Services, the LA County Department of Children and Family Services, has had to investigate what is happening and to figure out why our children are being taken away at such high rates, because either they believe that there's something wrong with Black people or there's racism happening in the system. And we all know that the reality is that there's anti-Blackness and racism happening in the system. And so those are some of the details or information about child welfare and Black children and families specifically in LA. Another reason why we wanted to talk about this issue this month is because we know that the police system that we have all been fighting to not just change, but like, I'm an abolitionist, BLM, many of our members are abolitionists. We don't believe that we need police in our communities to keep us safe, right? Well, we already don't believe that. We've seen what's been going on just at Jesse Owens Park a couple weeks ago, where people were harassed by the police, arrested. for resisting arrest, which made no sense. And so we know that when we have more police in our communities, that doesn't help us. Well, guess what? Here in LA County, just 2 weeks ago, the LA Sheriff's Department tried to get permission from the Department of Children and Family Services and from LA County to actually be able to go to homes unannounced and knock on doors to do a welfare check to see if our children were safe, right? So you imagine what that looks like, right? Sheriff's Department gets permission to just go around and just knock on our doors and see if our children are safe. We know that that's not why they're there. And so luckily, the LA County Department of Children and Family Services said, nope, Sheriff's Department, we don't need you to come and do that. And we're glad that was a victory that we had that, that they said no. But that does not mean that our families are any safer with the way that the system operates between the Department of Children and Family Services and the police. So we have this really dynamic panel here for you all today to talk about this issue in more depth. And so we're gonna start off with Dr. Akin Abioye, who is a fellow, I'm just gonna talk like because we're friends, right? Everybody on this panel, we're all friends, we know each other, and hopefully y'all feel that way too. But this is a brilliant man who's been organizing for many, many years since he was a young person, and has been organizing foster youth, and also as a researcher, and has his doctorate, and has overcome a whole lot, and is just doing the damn thing. And so he's gonna come and talk to us about this, how these systems are interconnected, and what is really going on with families. Like, do we actually need to be concerned at the rates at which, the Sheriff's Department and DCF is saying about our children? So, Akin?
How much time do I have to do the talk?
Don't talk for too long. Maybe like
a few minutes.
We can make it a dialogue. We can make it a dialogue.
That's what I like. Yeah, I mean, again, so I always start with this. Interestingly, is that I'm an expert on foster care because I spent my entire life in foster care here in LA. But also, I'm a researcher who researches the experiences and narrative of foster care, and I've worked at all levels of policy related to foster care. And when it comes to this kind of current crisis of where we are in this moment around child welfare and kind of neglect and abuse, I think what I always like to share with people is only about 20% of kids enter foster care because they were physically abused or sexually abused, right? So often we think about foster care as this kind of system that is saving and protecting children from abuse. And the actual reality is, just as BLM is an abolitionist when it comes to the carceral state and policing, I'm an abolitionist when it comes to child welfare. Black people have been taking care of other Black people's children since and before they were enslaved, right? When a young child was left after their parent was murdered, some other mother cared for that child. And so caring for our children is not something new to Black people. However, this child welfare system was created, and up until, interestingly, about the 1980s, really the 90s, at the height of the so-called crack epidemic, Black children were almost exclusively left out of child welfare, meaning they actually didn't even allow Black people to be in foster care. And then they created this kind of this crack cocaine crisis that they call, and then now we're disproportionately overrepresented. And now we're in this kind of moment where Black people have always been surveilled, and this narrative now is, well, how is COVID-19 affecting Black families in terms of their being at risk for foster care? Like LaMikia said, we're only at risk insofar as we're surveilled and not trusted. Black women are not trusted to be good mothers. Black men are seen as absent, although the research shows us that Black men are more likely than white men to sit down and eat dinner with their children at night. So when we think about all of those things combined, really what really makes us at risk is really this over policing, right? I think about at my office, I got a notice that they have now shifted more uniformed police officers to the area, right? And so in this crisis, I think about, instead of thinking about how are children more at risk of entering foster care or being abused, it's really like, think about how are children more likely to develop meaningful relationships with their parents. How many more Black parents are now, albeit maybe unwillingly because they were laid off, are eating dinner every night with their children? in their right, and like how is this crisis actually reinforcing the bonds of Black families, I think is another paradigm that we should really be exploring. Talk about this kind of child welfare narrative with COVID-19. I'll stop there because I could talk forever.
No, and you hitting on all the important points, right? I think everything you said about these false stories, these narratives that somehow Black families are incapable of taking care of our own children is asinine, right? Like when you really think about it, Black families, Black people have not only been taking care of our own children for generations, we've been taking care of other people's children for generations, right?
Mm-hmm.
White folks had no problem with us taking care of their kids when our ancestors were enslaved, and they were perfectly capable of taking care of white people's children and nursing them and all kinds of stuff. And then all of a sudden, we're incapable of taking care of our own children and families, and it just doesn't make sense. And so I think one of the questions that I have for you is when you think about what you just shared, right? Especially this point around fathers, because there's this notion that Black fathers don't care or are not present in their children's lives. But you're saying that the data is showing us otherwise, right? And I know you happen to be a father yourself, and you have dinner with your children all the time. Why do you think that narrative exists? Like, where does it come from, and how does it impact what we're seeing, not just in COVID, but this in this tension between the over policing and families in child welfare?
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question. I think from my perspective, I think about this kind of this myth of what's always been talked about before, this idea of the super predator, right? So if you want to talk about the kind of like destruction of families, right, you have to pick it apart piece by piece, bit by bit. And so if we create this narrative, which is in a true sense, if we over police and incarcerate Black men, they're more likely to not be present, but when they are, they're more likely to be present, to be engaged, right? And I think about if we're going to kind of have this myth of the welfare queen, of the kind of neglected and abused child, we also can't have, let me stop claiming it, the state can't also have the narrative of kind of Black families being whole and complete, and also being clear, a Black family can still be whole and complete without a man present. And so there's this idea that in order for a family to be whole and complete, a man must be present. And yeah, I have a very nuclear family with my 3 children and, a baby mama and a wife now, right? But also like, although I live in that nuclear paradigm, like, oh, I know a whole lot of women who hold it down and their family is doing just fine. Most of us were probably raised by single women, right? So like, even like the misogyny and patriarchy go hand in hand with the destruction of the identity of Blackness.
You spitting fire right now.
I'll be trying.
That you doing it. And I really appreciate you shedding light on that, because I think people buy into these myths and start to demonize Black men. And then also, like you said, right, the welfare queen and all of that, and don't understand that these things are really interconnected with over policing, with the history that you just shared, and this desire to really paint a picture that we don't know how to love and care for one another when we are some of the most loving and caring people that you will find on this planet. So I appreciate you, and I know we're going to come back and hear more from you in a minute. This is a nice thing about, for those of you who've been watching, this is our 11th, This Is Not a Drill. And in the past few weeks, we've had them on, not past few weeks, it's 11. So for the past 11 weeks, we've had them on Instagram Live, but now we have it on Zoom and on Facebook. And so it helps us to be able to have a dialogue, more of a conversation with the group. So we'll come back to you in a minute. As you were sharing, I was thinking about my own personal experience with child welfare system. So my husband and I have actually been foster parents, and as well as kinship caregivers, and have had some really challenging experiences with the child welfare system. When you talk about this, people buying into this idea that Black families cannot care for themselves, we experienced a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism when we decided to become kinship caregivers for a family member of ours. And the DCFS first of all, they wouldn't acknowledge that we were even potential kinship caregivers. And they tried to keep us from being able to get the child, right? And so she ended up in a detention center before she even came to stay with us, which I think is like, why would you put a child in a detention center when they have a family who was perfectly willing and capable to care for them, right? This is the kind of stuff that we're seeing with our families, like how many other kids are being put into detention centers, and no child should be put into a detention center, right? And so it just, when you were saying that, it just raised a whole lot of emotions in me about that experience with that. So I want to turn the conversation over to Miss Miranda here. Miranda Sheffield and I are also good friends. She's a BLM organizer and a brilliant woman and mother who has studied, I mean, she moved over to London to get to get some real deep education through African studies, and brought that back here with her in the advocacy work that she's doing, both on a personal level and in a professional space too. So I would love to hear from you about, tell us about how some of these things are interconnected when it comes to systemic racism and oppression, and how that ties to the child welfare system.
Thank you, LaMikia, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be on this call, because I think the way of how you opened up with making sure that we acknowledge, you know, the harm that has been caused, the murdering and the I mean, just the outright blatant disrespect of not really seeing us as folks with what's taken place in Minnesota. I think what we must never forget about is that what's happening in Minnesota is not isolated just when we think of police, and that there's all these other systems that are currently in place right now that are manipulating and causing the same type of harm that we're seeing on the streets when we see us being murdered by the police. And I think as much as just a lot of what my wonderful friend, Dr. Akin, said about this is that we really need to understand is that there's a historical legacy about what the child welfare system has represented and what it has tried to perpetuate itself as. As he mentioned before, only 20% of folks come in who have any type of physical abuse. Most of those who come in, especially here in Los Angeles County, there's a disproportionate amount of folks who are particularly Black, who overly represent the foster care system. And what I think about is that I think about how it's a generational thing that has been happening, not just in this particular moment, but has been going on for many moments to come. And the people who are affected by it have also been affected by the probation system. They've also been affected by the carceral state. They have also been affected by, you know, the many different representations of institutions. It's been very intersectional when we think about foster care. So when we're seeing these displays of outright deaths taking place on the streets, I think it's important to think about Mark Lamont Hill wrote a really good book, From Ferguson to Palestine. And he talked about how even before we heard that moment, I can't breathe, there were already things in place that led to the inevitable of him coming into place with these very systems that cause harm because of his class position, because of the communities that he was in, because of the health challenges that he was being faced with, and all of the demographics that were going on there. So I think it's just extremely important when we're thinking about these issues that we're constantly having to move through, when we're thinking about the harm that our family members are caused. Foster care doesn't need to be reformed. It needs to be abolished from the bottom up. It needs to look in a way where those of us, like myself, I've come through the foster care system. I've been an organizer with BLM, and I understand I experienced a state-sanctioned childhood moving through the foster care system. I knew as I continued to raise my level of consciousness, I knew that my mother, regardless of what it said on some court paper, that my mother, being a Black mother in the mid-90s, she was going to in some way end up coming into contact with these systems that says that she's not doing an adequate job in whatever those matrix and marks are. That those things were going to take place because just of the lived reality of that we live in a hetero-capitalistic system. And so for me, I really want to be able to like push us, as much as it's hard to in these moments, to think that we need to just think about law enforcement, how law enforcement is causing all, the carceral state. We need to think just as much about how do we reimagine how these systems that we see causing the most harm are the ones that we need to think about when we center the community first, when we make sure that the community is the anchor and the very people who are protecting us, and it's not having to call DCFS every time we feel like harm is taking place. Just in the same way, when we say, if something's happening to a community member, what does it look like for us to know that we have someone in our community that we can call? And if something's happening where we feel there's harm taking place in our families, why we say the same thing about not wanting to call the cops. Well, what does it look like for us to say that we need to have someone to call though when it's not DCFS? And I think those are the conversations that we really need to think about, because we can see that these systems are not for us. And we need to reimagine policy, community organizing, doing the work that we're doing to think of them in a totally different way.
Yes. I agree with everything you just said. Snaps to everything you just said. I think a lot of times, right, for the same reason that people think I'm calling the police because the police are here to help, people think I'm calling the Department of Children and Family Services because they are going to help. And what I've been telling folks is, based on my experience with the system, they're not here for us. They're not here for us. If they were here for us, we wouldn't have an overrepresentation of Black children in foster care. We wouldn't, right? Because our kids are being ripped away from our families. They're being placed in foster care. And as you mentioned, you have all of these systemic issues. Why are kids being taken away? Well, you would believe when you look at the news, because we're being abused. Our kids are just being, lives are being taken. And I'm not trying to diminish the fact that is some people's experience, right? And we want to protect the children who need to be protected. But when you look at the numbers, it just doesn't make sense. If 20% of the kids are being removed because of abuse, that means 80% of them are not. So what has happened with that other 80%, right? The primary reason that children are removed from their homes is for neglect. Why are they, what does that even mean? That means that there's a mother who is working a graveyard shift, and she has to leave her 12-year-old and her 10-year-old at home to work her graveyard shift because she can't afford to get a child care provider, and she doesn't have any additional support at this time. And so she's taking care of her kids by going and getting a paycheck to put a roof over their head and provide food. A neighbor calls the police on her instead of saying, you know what, I noticed that you've been leaving your children at home at nighttime. Do you need some help to take care of your kids? They call in 911 to say this person is neglecting or abusing their kids, right? And the children end up in the foster care system, and that's just not acceptable. It's not acceptable. Because when the kids end up in the foster care system, a lot of times the outcomes are even worse, right? For those of you who don't know, there was this young man in Michigan named Cornelius Frederick, who was placed in a group home. And in the group home, there was some kind of incident that took place where one of the staff in the group home, actually, this is a young Black man, choked him out, right? Like, they literally put hands on him because he threw some food, is what I read in the news. He threw some food in the food hall. And so somebody came to restrain him, and they choked him out. So he had to go to the hospital because he was choked nearly to death. And when he got to the hospital, they learned he had COVID, right? He had the coronavirus. And so what happened to him? Unfortunately, this young man died, right? How did he end up in the foster care system in the first place? Well, he had a parent who had died several years ago, right? And the child welfare department in Michigan decided that he didn't have family members who could take care of him, when we know our family members are always willing to step up to take care of our children and other people's children. Unfortunately, after that incident took place, there was, of course, they had to test. Now they found that there was this young man in this group home who needed to be, who had coronavirus. So they tested the rest of the group home. Now all of the other children in the group home, 90-something% of them, they said, had coronavirus as well, right? Right. And on top of that, they can't see their parents, right? They're not able to be surrounded by the people who love them, because the system says that we don't know how to love our children. And so again, these things are interconnected. I'm gonna, Miranda, come back to you too in this conversation in a couple minutes, but I wanna hear from Chris. So Chris Martin, hey, welcome to the conversation.
Hey.
Chris is an attorney, a dependency attorney. And for those of you who don't know what that means that he represents families in the child welfare court. So if a person's children is taken away, Chris works with them to figure out what is the process for getting their children back and supports them in that. He is also a member of Black Lives Matter and on our legal team. So we love Chris and are honored to have him to share his legal advice and wisdom with us. So can you, Chris, I want to hear a little bit from you about what is happening right now in COVID. We know that Black kids are overrepresented in the child welfare system outside of this virus. But then now, with the virus happening, right, where are our kids? How are they being housed? How are they being taken care of? Are parents able to interact with them? What's going on there?
Well, unfortunately, COVID-19 has severely impacted families who are involved with DCFS. Um, Notably, the presiding judge, I believe his name is Judge Greenberg, actually had put a blanket suspension on all visitation for every parent and child who does not, or I'm sorry, for every parent who does not have their child. Visitation was suspended for all of those parents, so they were not allowed to physically come in contact with their children, and their visitation was remanded to FaceTime and Skype or over the phone visits. Now, we thought that it was a victory when the presiding judge vacated that order, but essentially what he's done is given that power to DCFS. And essentially DCFS has exercised that power to the extreme. They are essentially blanket suspending all visitation for all of these parents. And so no one knows when COVID-19 is going to end, but that could have disastrous consequences for the bonds that need to be established with these parents and their children, especially if you're talking about newborn children or toddlers whose parents have been removed from them, maybe even since birth. And so not only that, but we see that essentially the way to get your children back is to do what's called reunification services, right? That means that you're doing classes and programs that are designed to eliminate the issues that brought you before the court. So if the court feels that you have a substance abuse problem, you would need to get into a substance abuse program. Or if they feel that you have a domestic violence problem, then you would need to get into a domestic violence program. So essentially, you have to do these services in order to get your children back. But what's happening now is, due to COVID-19, a lot of these programs and these classes are closing. They've been closed. And so that has also been delaying the parents being able to do the services that they need to do in order to get their children back. I do note that some classes have been changed to online classes, but we don't necessarily know if that's the case for every single client that we have. And so that is making it extremely difficult for these parents to be able to reunify. So it's a very tragic situation all around. And while I, as an attorney, actually do have the power to submit petitions on behalf of these parents to get the court to review the visitation suspension, in theory, in practice, these petitions aren't really going anywhere. DCFS essentially has the discretion to be able to suspend the visitation and thereby suspend these relationships and suspend the bonding that parents should be having with their children. So, and that appears like that power is going to be wielded indefinitely.
God, thanks, Chris, for sharing all that. And it, of course, makes me angry to hear that parents are unable to see their children, that children are unable to see their parents. I have a 7-month-old, right? So just to think about the fact that if, and heaven forbid this ever, I wouldn't ever let this happen, but for DCFS to somehow get involved in my life and take my child away, and then you're supposed to be able to interact with a 7-month-old or a newborn, as you mentioned, toddlers or any child by FaceTime. How is that an actual visitation, right? And we know that the data shows us, and we even without data, we know that you need to have that physical touch to be in contact with your child for that bonding opportunity. And so for our rights to be taken away, for the rights of families to be taken away right now, to be able to actually have that interaction is just, I don't even have words for it.
Yes.
Can you?
I should also note that it's important that there are actually a lot of parents who are like right on the cusp of being able to get their children back. And if it wasn't for COVID-19, the hearing that they would have been able to participate in, that would have essentially granted them the ability to have their children back, has been postponed for months and sometimes even into next year. We're talking like February of 2021, that some of these parents who would have gotten their children back had their regularly scheduled hearing taken place this month or last month. Now they may have to wait until like next year. Now, what some of us are doing, some of us lawyers are doing, is we are trying to work with one another to see how we can facilitate or agree on, or essentially we're trying to work with DCFS to see how they can facilitate the return of the children home. But oftentimes it's always going to be that they're in disagreement with returning the children home without a hearing, or perhaps the children's lawyer is going to be in disagreement with returning the children home without a hearing. And so some of those parents who were just right there on the cusp and had that hearing taking place, you know what I mean, today or last week when it was supposed to happen, yeah, they're not getting their children back anytime soon.
Yeah, which makes me, again, very angry, right? Because what does that mean for the families? That means that our kids are separated from their family. You can't get that time back. You can't get that time back. These are, again, mostly Black families. I know it's all families in the system, but this is mostly Black families. The system is disproportionately Black people, Black children that have been ripped apart, ripped away from our homes because people believe we can't take care of our kids. And then even when we've done everything that we can to demonstrate, which we shouldn't even have to go through that in the first place. I shouldn't have to prove to you that I can take care of my child when I love my child. That's how I feel about the situation. Right? But then even when you've done that, you still can't get your child back because it sounds like there are certain folks who are trying to hold up that process until next year. And yeah, I'm like at a loss for words for that, because I didn't even realize that was happening in terms of delays and people being reunified with their families. And it makes me very angry. We had a question from Facebook, and thank you all who are watching us on Facebook, by the way, Facebook Live. We appreciate y'all tuning into this conversation around COVID-19 and the impacts of this virus on the child welfare system and the greater child welfare system, and the ways in which policing and surveillance and over-policing and anti-Blackness are interconnecting to actually tear and rip apart Black families and keep us apart, as you are hearing right now. But we had a question from Facebook Live, and somebody said, is CASA our court-appointed special advocate, so people who come and advocate on behalf of children, are they supporting in any of this at all? Chris, you know anything about what CASA is able to do here?
Yeah, generally they tend to be for, just making sure that the child is okay. They may not necessarily be, they're kind of more so a neutral party, and are not necessarily on the parent side, but will advocate for what they believe to be in the child's best interest, which sometimes they will, like the children's lawyer, may think that those interests are different or adverse to what the parents' interests are. If that answers your question. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you need me to be more clear about that.
I think it does. And then if somebody, whoever asked that question, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get those answered. But Chris, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and enraging us even further with this information about how our families are being kept apart. Obviously in the Black community, this is not anything that's new to us. Our families have been ripped apart from the time before we came here, right? Our families were ripped apart when we were in Africa to enslave our ancestors here in this country. So we've been torn apart for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's continuing in the systems that exist right now, and it's really disheartening. And I'm in agreement with our other speakers here, Dr. Abioye and Miranda, that this system needs to be abolished. It does not work for us. It doesn't work for our families. It does nothing. It's harmful. It's doing more harm than it is doing good. And it's important for us to have the voices of folks who have been impacted by the system being the ones who are leading the charge. And if y'all have been in the system and y'all are saying this system is trash and it's hurting us more than it's helping us, then we shouldn't have the system, right? And so I'm with it. I'm with the need to completely not just transform or reform, but completely abolish the system, because we know how to take care of our kids, and we'll come together to make that happen. And it's important for us to have the voices of folks who sorry, there was a little, I think there's a delay in the Facebook Live feed, and it came through on somebody's speaker, but that's okay. So our last, but certainly not least, our last speaker for today is Megan Castillo, who y'all all know Megan's lovely face because she has been doing so much great organizing and leading a lot of the work around Jackie Lacey Must Go. I want to also call that out, right? The court system is absolutely involved in this process, and either way, no matter what, Jackie Lacey needs to leave. So Megan has been leading that work, and which I may not know about Megan is that she actually is getting her social work degree right now from USC. Yes, fight on Trojans. We got all kinds of issues, but I still got to do my fight on. So she's getting her master's in social work degree from USC, and is going to speak to us about some work that she's been doing, actually about creating a movement of social workers who are abolitionists and believe that we need to figure out how to abolish the system because it ain't working for our kids and families. So Megan, can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, family. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. But yeah, so this idea came about when I reached out to a few social workers to kind of speak to a comment that Chief Moore actually made in the LA Times, I believe, this week. And he said something to the degree of police officers are now serving as therapists and social workers and interventionists and all of these things. And, we as abolitionists are like, there's no way that you are even capable of providing that kind of service, adequate service to our communities. One, because you're not trained, and two, because you do more harm to our communities anyway. And so when I reached out to a few social workers, I was actually surprised by, their responses, because they were kind of erring on the side of supporting law enforcement. And me doing the work that I do, knowing, the harm that police officers often inflict on our communities, I just couldn't stand behind it. And so literally yesterday, I decided to create a group called Radical Black Abolitionist Social Workers. And so the idea behind this is basically intended to serve as a support group for Black women who are radical, to be transformative and social justice warriors, because we have to foster that space for each other. And then it's also intended to serve as a think tank, to mobilize and organize globally as social workers. And then it's intended to provide a space for Black women who are social workers to continue to take part in the fight for Black liberation, right? And so for me, it's just one of those things where I'm a part of multiple groups on Facebook, and I'm having dialogues with multiple Black women around the current climate that we're seeing, and how white supremacy is basically taking its toll on our communities. And so as a social worker, we're like, what do we do? And as I am becoming a social worker, I will officially have my degree next year. But as I'm training to be a social worker and learning how to be a social worker, I'm becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the close ties that social workers have to work with law enforcement. And so oftentimes we have to call law enforcement when there's a crisis or for intervention. And so me knowing and having my own lived experiences with law enforcement being traumatic, and then also constantly being fed this steady diet of police brutality on social media, my immediate response is not going to be, let me call a police officer for safety, right? And so immediately that takes me to this idea, this concept, this framework of abolition and transformative justice. And so we know, like, it's not necessarily understood globally, right? But we also know that in order to be effective and engage in political strategies, we have to operate from a framework and praxis of abolition, right? So that includes racism, that includes patriarchy, that includes capitalism, that includes the prison industrial complex and all of its cronies at the local level, policing our communities. And while this may be an uncomfortable conversation, it's really a necessary one because folks don't want to see police show up at their doors, right? Like we just did a survey with People's Budget LA, and overwhelmingly, only 5% said maybe let's have, cops in our community. 5%. 5% of the budget should go to policing. That's a clear indication that folks do not want police in their communities, right? They'd rather see that money go to their communities. They'd rather see that money go to resources for housing, for mental health, for food, apartheid, for medical assistance. They'd rather see that money be utilized in other ways that would be useful, to their community and conducive to their community. And so for me, as a social worker, taking part in both the theory of abolition and the practice, we have to be committed to the work of unpinning the system, ending the systems that be, right? And making sure that prisons and policing and domestic and international warfare on our folks are no longer possible, right? So we have to recognize that the work on a local level is directly linked to that is happening. Someone mentioned in Palestine, it's directly linked to what's happening across the globe. And it's overwhelming for me to have a conversation about policing because they are in our communities, right? We're being inundated with information about just how harmful and how dangerous and how deadly contact with police has become. And so I'd be curious to see, where we go from here. How can we move forward with a framework that forces us to unlearn what we've been force-fed, right? Forces us to unlearn how we've been socialized and reimagine a completely new word. Like folks are, they get discouraged when you think about utopias, but honestly, that's the grounds by which we have to move. That's how we have to be motivated to see a world that doesn't look like we've seen today, right? If we actually want to talk about safety for our Black families, right, we have to challenge ourselves to reimagine a world where Black families can actually thrive. And that's kind of the framework by which I've come up with this group, but we'll see what happens.
Well, I absolutely love it, Megan. This is I love your thinking. I love the way that you're seeing these different systems interconnected and imagining what people would say is a utopia. But for us, like it shouldn't even be a utopia, right? Like it literally just needs to be the way we live. How do we create a space where we can thrive and be safe and not rely on these systems that were not created for us or designed for us in the first place? They were designed to oppress us. They literally were designed to enslave us. Right. And they kept us enslaved for generation after generation after generation after generation. And here we are still operating within these systems, and people think, okay, maybe we could just transform the system, or let's do some reform. Reform does not work when the system is operating the way it was designed to, right? Which is to rip our families apart and to keep us enslaved from the very beginning. So Megan, thank you so much for sharing about that. We actually had somebody in Facebook land ask us how they can get involved in this group that you have started.
Well, it's just a random Facebook group. It's called Radical Black Abolitionist Social Workers. So feel free to tap in if you'd like. There's really nothing there because it just started yesterday. We got about 30 folks who said, hey, I want to be a part of this. But really, I'm going to throw all my BLM stuff in there because I want folks to get tapping with BLM. Like, this is really what it's about. And I think if we can get more social workers engaged in this work that we're currently doing and building coalitions in that way, that we can really be a force to be reckoned with.
Well, they ain't ready. I tell you that right now. The world ain't ready for that forest, honey. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes left here, and I really want to open this up to more of a dialogue between the panelists and the audience. So if you are watching us on Facebook Live, please drop your comments in the chat, and I'm sorry, not your comments and your questions, and we'll get those over to us and get them to the panelists. One of the things that, Megan just talked to us about is how these systems are interconnected and how social workers, one of the first things that they're supposed to do if they encounter any kind of situation that there's a safety concern is call the police, right? But if you don't believe, and not just you don't believe, for a fact that police do not make Black communities safer, then you as a social worker, like, what are you supposed to do in that situation, right? And so I actually had an experience with this just recently. In December, my partner and I, my husband and I, ended up being an emergency foster care placement for a child. And interestingly enough, the social worker said to us, this was on Christmas morning, I kid you not, right? She said to us, I'm going to be coming over. I'm waiting for my partner to arrive, right? Guess who her partner was? Her partner were 2 officers, cops. She showed up to my place with 2 cops, did not notify me that cops were her partners, right? I'm thinking that as a partner, I didn't even think to ask. And I'm a person who, I didn't mention this at the beginning, I forgot to say a little bit about myself, but I've worked on child welfare issues for a long time. My family has a lot of experience with the child welfare system. I personally have experience with the child welfare system, in addition to being a caregiver, and have a lot of experience with the police, right? And definitely do not want the police showing up at my apartment unannounced on Christmas morning with my first Christmas. I told y'all I have a 7-month-old, the first Christmas that I'm celebrating with my son. And so she said she was coming with her partners, and her partner happened to be 2 cops who I've already had some negative experiences with in the past. And so you can imagine how traumatizing that was. And why would she not even tell us that this is who was coming? And they're supposed to enter your home. And I was like, no, they not coming into my home. Right. And so think about that, right? That our children, the child was traumatized too. This is a child who is, had already had an experience with the cops. It was not a positive experience with the cops, as you can imagine. This is a Black child. And now this child is expecting a social worker to come, and the social worker is showing up with the same cops that she already had a negative experience with. These things don't need to be happening in our communities. It's traumatizing already for the child to have been removed from their family. It's traumatizing then to be placed with a different family, or in a group home, or in the detention center. And then it's more traumatizing to have a social worker show up with cops on Christmas morning, right? Or any morning, for that matter, if you're a Black person in this country. I just had to share that because they really, again, all these stories that y'all have been sharing they hit on a personal level. And I know it's not just for me, because we know that 25% of the children in foster care in LA County are Black, which means that that's literally thousands of Black children and families that have come in contact with this system, right? So Megan, at the end, you told us that you want to challenge folks to upend this system, right? And to disconnect, not just disconnect, but actually literally abolish police system, child welfare system, all of that. So I want to open it up to the panelists to share a little bit more about what are your thoughts on that? Like, where do we begin with that process? How do we start to chip away at this, or not just chip away at it, like chop off whole blocks of these things to make sure our kids and our families are not ripped apart by these systems that interconnect to oppress our people? Whoever wants to jump in. Megan, you already unmuted yourself. You ready? Go ahead. You've been thinking about this. You've been thinking about this. Y'all don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one way is political education, right? And then also just being willing to get involved. So tap in with organizations that are already doing the work. right? So y'all are clearly on Facebook Live and you guys are watching this. Sign up for our newsletter, right? BLMLA.org, and get tapped in, because there are folks who have been doing this work, right? We're standing on the shoulders of giants, and our ancestors have already laid the foundation for us. And so I think it's just a matter of really tapping into that freedom work and really, you know, getting educated and forcing yourself to unlearn. Like, when I tell you, it's probably the most uncomfortable but yet liberating process to be able to say, we're not going to stand for this. I see what's happening. I'm taking the blinders off. I'm not taking the blue pill or red pill no more. Like, it's time to wake up type of thing. And I think when we radically, right, and Angela Davis says radical means simply grasping things at the root. When we radically look from that lens and really say we demand wellness for our Black families and wellness for our Black youth, it gets that much more easier for us to really dive into the work and to really see and imagine a place where Black folks can actually thrive.
Yes, honey. Thank you. Thank you. Grab it at the roots. Be radical. Let's hear from Dr. Abioye. We haven't heard from you in a minute. What are your thoughts here? What are some things that people can do? How do we start to
Yeah, I mean, I think I love what Megan said. Think about this radical alternative. So what really is unimaginable and seems unattainable as an alternative to the carceral state, the child welfare, the police state, right? Like all this state sanctioned violence is like thinking through, well, not just like how do I get involved? A lot of people's first kind of like gut reaction to like child welfare is, how do I get involved? What can I do? And it's like, yeah, those are like only temporary solutions, right? They're band-aids on compound fractures. It's like, that's today. We do need foster parents and all that good stuff, right? In the immediate, but like the real work is really like jumping on the train of like thinking through how do you systemically engage in policy change and shifts that really shift towards keeping families together. And I mean, I just wrote about this a few weeks back, and folks hated me. I was like, things that we can do is end foster care. Everyone was like all in my inbox, but like for real, like think, right? Like just think about that. Like, yeah, let's just like end foster care. Period. Right? Like that's it. Just end it. Whatever it is you want to do, whether it be organizing at the community level, grass tops level, like that should be our mantra. Just end it.
No, I agree with that. And I want to hear from Miranda and Chris too in the last few minutes we haven't. As a professor, one of the things when I talk about ending policing, right? Like we can just abolish the police, and people are like, no, we can't. Why? What are you talking about? And I say, well, my ancestors came to this country as enslaved human beings, right? We built the foundation, the economic fabric of this country, and we abolished this. We abolished, right, the slavery system the way that it was initially designed. If we could do that, then we could definitely abolish this other stuff, because this is small potatoes compared to what, like literally you had free enslaved human beings working as animals in this country, and we fought to end that. Why can we not fight to end the carceral system the way that it operates today, or just end it, period? The child welfare system, because if it's not working for us, why do we need them? We don't need them. And the enslavement of our people was working for this country. It wasn't working for us, but it was working for this country, right? So if we could actually turn that around, because we freed ourselves, right? Like we were the ones who fought in the war to get our freedom. If we could do that, why can't we not do the rest of these things? I think it's absolutely possible. And it sounds crazy, and it is radical because it's grabbing it at the roots, right? And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being radical. Miranda, I see Miranda trying to jump in here. So go ahead, honey. Let us know what you're thinking.
Yes, Megan, everything that has been said in this is just spot on. And I think there needs to, both me and Akin know that sometimes we're the less likely folks to be invited to some panels. We're not the first, people on those lists sometimes, because these are not the conversations that those who are in positions of power within child welfare really want to have these conversations, because it's literally pulling at the root, meaning that 25-year experience that you've had of being in this child welfare system is no longer needed, because we know how to have our own self-determination to reimagine what this child welfare system looks like, where it's centered around families and communities and about us thriving. And I think because there's just been this narrative that there's such a need for foster care, there's such a, if we don't have this, then what else? What are going to happen to these poor, vulnerable children that are struggling in their communities? We need to help them. There's such a saviorism thing attached to this that it's just extremely difficult to think of, well, this is just not going to work because we have to save the children. And when I think the reality is that we've always known how to take care of ourselves. We just haven't had the resources to do that in our communities. When you look at the density of South LA having such a huge amount of, children petitions and different things coming out with removal, it's not saying that South LA is not a community that is not thriving and that does not have resiliency. It's saying that there's something particularly about the density of the folks that are represented there that we just do not see it tangible for them to continue to live and thrive in this community. And we always have to keep a certain type of a certain type of eye on this group of folks. So I think just in the same way, a couple years ago, when there was this whole situation taking place, when we started seeing with 45, when he was, putting families in cages, and there was just this big uproar about separation of families. And I did not want to take away from that conversation, but I also wanted to acknowledge that some people get really hyped up about these particular silo moments, but don't realize that separation of families were taking place at Edelman Children's Court for many, many years. It's been in the works. It's been happening. If you go down and just sit in that courthouse and you just look at, it's me and it's Black and it's brown folks that are having their families removed constantly. So when we change how we enter into this conversation, when we change what it means to even think about these different social justice lenses that we have, we cannot just think that, foster care is just this one, okay, well, we can abolish everything else, but because they're vulnerable and these families are going to need somebody. Yeah, and it's not to take away that we know that, just like what said earlier, we know that harm exists, but it can't just be on the state to decide how and what how the framework looks in order for us to be able to move through these issues. Because I will tell you this, as someone who's grown up in the foster care system and has directly experienced a state-sanctioned childhood, I know before anything else that I'm a Black woman in this world. I know that I'm a Black woman who's moving through this. And if it were not for my political education, as Megan has mentioned, if it were not for me aligning myself in situations to understand the more systemic issues that led to me being in foster care, I think I would have definitely just moved through as this, like, I made it out of foster care, I beat the system. Because that's so much more what they want us to be able to project, and what they want us to be able to put forward is that we were able to beat the odds, but never understanding the very system that caused us to be in this position to say what odds I had to beat in the first place. So it's just a matter for me of how important it is for us to never forget what existed, the family legacies that were in place, the erasure of so much that I think when you come into the foster care system, you grow up in the foster care system, that the level of white supremacy I think that exists is that does not allow you to really see your own cultural roots that are represented in the things that I think represent us having to interface with these very systemic levels of oppression that is going on. I think we need to really, really, really be okay with reimagining what it looks like for us to be able to have something that is not this. Because when you see 3 or 4 generations of family coming through the courthouse, it's not saying that that family is the one that is causing the issues. It's saying that this is the very system that it's well oiled to continuously be able to capture, I feel like, and to snatch these families in the ways that it does, because, what else is it there for, if not that?
No, Ashe, and Ashe, everything you just said, girl. I feel like I wish we had some more time to continue this conversation because there's just so much to be said. And I think it's been very enlightening for a lot of folks. Chris, I'm going to have you give us the last word here before I turn it over to Megan to close us out with the SADA.
Sure. I think that we as Black people have to recognize who is not on our side. And ultimately, DCFS is not on your side. They are not on your side. The police are not on your side. They do not want you to win. And when you call DCFS on a family member, or when you call DCFS on somebody within your own nuclear family, especially to report them, to report the father of your children, or to report the mother of your children, you have to recognize that what DCFS is doing is that they are pointing that proverbial gun at both of you. They're trying to see how they can take the children from both of you, not just on, the person that you reported, on your partner or your spouse, or, your boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever you want to call it. So with that in mind, you have to be able to think about those alternatives to calling DCFS, because honestly, once you get to me, it's kind of too late. You know what I mean? Based on my experience as a lawyer in this system, it's sad to say, but I'm just gonna say it with no filter. It is a kangaroo court. You know what I mean? You don't really have too many rights, which these courts are bound to respect as a parent. You're not Mirandized. You're not told like criminal defendants are told when they're getting arrested, that you have the right to remain silent and that anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Although that is exactly what social workers are doing. And so honestly, once these parents get to me, most of the time it's because they've unfortunately incriminated themselves, and they've made voluntary statements that they didn't necessarily know were going to be used against them. And oftentimes it's because, unfortunately they may tell on each other. But there are services out there that are designed to eliminate problems in the home, those familial problems that don't involve calling DCFS. If you are the victim of domestic violence, there are, domestic violence shelters out there that will help you to be able to deal with that issue, versus, calling DCFS and then they take the children from both of you, right? They hold victims equally accountable, victims of domestic violence equally accountable to perpetrators of domestic violence. And they say, well, to the extent that you let this man into the home who was violent, we don't believe that you're a fit mother, or if you're a father who, I've definitely seen men who are also victims of domestic violence. So, it's the same thing. If they're the victim and they're reporting the mother who is the violent person to DCFS, then DCFS is saying that that father who let that mother into the home is not fit to be an adequate parent of those children. So they take them from both. And so with that in mind, I would also say that 211la.org is another great resource for just programs that or classes that you could take, or programs that you can just get into in order to eliminate the need from calling DCFS. Not only that, but we got people at Black Lives Matter looking out for you, standing on the front lines for you. You know what I mean? And we are resources for you. So with that in mind, think twice before you call DCFS, and think twice before you call mandated reporters such as police and things of that sort. So thank you.
Ashe, and ashe to all of that. And I know we are over time, so we really appreciate y'all sticking around and listening to this very important conversation. I want to say thank you to our panelists, Dr. Abioye, Miranda, Chris, Megan. Y'all have shed so much light on this topic and have really just given us the information that we need to think about what does it look like for us to reimagine not the system, like to tear the system down really, and to reimagine a different world and different options for safety for our community that does not involve DCFS, does not involve the police and all of these other systems that are not, they were never designed for us in the first place. They were never designed to protect us. They may act like they are designed to protect us. At the end of the day, they cause more harm than good. Our families are being ripped apart by these systems. We are seeing our loved ones being incarcerated. Our children are being placed in abusive homes. We didn't even get into that topic as much, right? When they get taken away from our homes, they get placed into homes with people who really don't care and are abusing them. And we need to put an end to that. So BLM is really committed to this work. We're abolitionists on on all fronts, that anything that's disproportionately impacting Black folks, anything that's hurting our community, we don't want to see those things in our community, period. And this is one of those things. And so I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who is going to lead us out. I guess you can lead out, right? Close us out in the power of Mama Asada. And she'll explain what we're going to do, and we're going to close out. So thank you so much.
LaMikia,
Yes.
before we close out, is it okay if we tell people how they can follow or to know about some of the stuff they would like to know, some of our work and stuff?
That's right, because on Instagram, we usually just drop it in there, but we haven't been able to do that. Yes, please do that.
Yes, so again, thank you everyone for joining this conversation. My name is Miranda Sheffield. If you would like to know any more about the work that's going on, I'm currently, BLM does not endorse candidates, but I'm currently a candidate that's running for city council in the city of Pomona. So if you can, please follow me at Miranda, the number 4, Pomona. I will put it in this Facebook Live group. And I'm thankful that we were able to have this conversation right before the end of National Foster Care Awareness Month. And LaMikia, this was just great, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. I hope we get to do it again.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. All right, Megan, to you. And then I think actually we can have one of our BLM comms people maybe drop everybody else's handles in the Facebook Live chat. Sound good? Awesome.
For sure. Okay, so within the interest of time, be sure to check us out in the comments, in the Facebook comments, and tap in with BLMLA at blmla.org, and follow us on Instagram at BLM Los Angeles. And then thank y'all for tuning in on Facebook. So it is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and protect one another.
We must
love and protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have
nothing to lose but our chains.
It is our duty to fight for freedom.
It is our
duty to fight for freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and protect one another.
We must love
and protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Ashe.
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 Thank you, everybody, so much. We are having another rally, not just a rally, a march, action on Saturday. So make sure you're following us on all of our social media platforms so you can take a look and get involved. Thank you so much. Take care.